Hey guys, we are here for our next session. We have Alessio from PieDao. He'll be doing a talk around how DAOs are a social layer for DeFi protocols. And I'll let him take it from here.
Hey guys. Hi everyone, my name is Alessio Del Monti, and as you already know, today I'm gonna speak a little bit about how do I think about DAOs are a social layer for DeFi protocol. So I'm gonna, yes, can you please confirm that you can hear me well? We can hear, great. Okay, I'm gonna toggle my video over here and switch to the talk. Now, this talk is really inspired by a couple of questions that I've been debating with a bunch of my DeFi friends and also within the PieDao community. And these questions are, why do we need governance in DeFi protocol in the first place? What's there to govern? And are DAOs the right answer to governing DeFi protocols? And then ultimately, I'm going to speak a little bit about how we are approaching governance in PieDao and specifically for governing pies. Now, before we go there, though, I'd like to start from here. Code is low. It's one of the most important and driving memes that crypto has been relying to. It's a very fascinating idea, and like the extreme majority of people in crypto relate to the idea of only having to trust code. But when we think about this meme, I think it's important to kind of take a step back and look in more details about what do we mean by code. Personally, I like the definition of that Nick Szabo did like in 2008, and pretty much the distinction between wet code versus dry code. Now, you might think about wet code as everything which is interpreted by the brain. So everything that actually happens in the human brain with all this controversy. And then you might think about dry code instead as everything, the actual machine code, which is interpreted by the computers. So you might say to some degree that if the code is written by humans, then every dry code is the result of encoding wet code. Now, why I think it's important, because eventually in the article where he made this distinction in 2008, Nick Szabo ended up with the conclusion that law is always wet code, which is interpreted by those on whom the law is imposed. I think this is an interesting conclusion, because it means that can code really be law? We will see. But obviously, this was 2008, and then you might think, yeah, but that it's kind of old. Like, what about crypto economics, right? And obviously, if you're in this conference, you all know what crypto economics is about. Well, like if we want to define it in a sentence, I think we might say that it's kind of a set of rules that use economic incentives in order to influence behavior. Now, there is a reason why crypto economics is probably not enough. And I think another guy explained it very well, and that was Vitalik Buterin, which in 2016 wrote, "Crypto economics is about agents with IQ 5 trying to control agents with IQ 150. Now, what I think he meant by that is, it's extremely unlikely to design, such a well thought system that can decline all the different scenario into code. So the creativity of human being will eventually, always be higher in terms of how do we exploit that code over there. And to be fair, this is not only an issue with code itself or with smart contracts specifically, but it's really kind of an issue with the nature of information itself, which turns out to be like very confusing. Now, if you look at information theory, like they have a distinction between syntactic information and semantic information, where syntactic information can really be defined as the rules between the relationships of symbol. So like we are talking by symbol, we mean something which can always be parsed in a deterministic way, can always be measured, which you can apply mathematical model on top of it. And then you have semantic information, right? And semantic information is really, what the kind of meaning that humans attach to those symbols. Or the way I like to think about it is really like the intent that people think about those symbols. Now, I'm telling all of this because, at the very core, I think the feature of a smart contract are really the processing of information. And it really turns out that, encoding semantic information is extremely hard. So it seems to be very unlikely that we are gonna able anytime soon to reach to a point where we can have smart contracts and therefore DeFi protocols kind of live on their own. So going back to the first question, why do we need governance in DeFi? Well, I would argue that because of the gap between wet code and dry code, coding will always be an iterative process. It's nearly impossible to get a smart contract right on the first try, but even if you can do that, you also need to take in consideration the community of people using it. DeFi protocols specifically are very special for many different reasons, but they also do this very interesting thing that the very first moment they reach to mainnet, they almost kind of become a living thing because of their community using it. And eventually that community becomes the social layer which needs to reach consensus of what the intent of those smart contracts might look like over time. So going back to our previous meme, I think a version of which I like a little bit more is the intent of code is low. And I would add that might change over time. Now let's go a little bit into the details of how governance actually might look like in practice for DeFi protocol. Now there is a wide spectrum of different governance action, and in this little list and this little map, it's not meant to be like an omni-comprehensive list, but it should give you some ideas. So governance can be as simple as some administration function, for instance, changing the fee for a specific protocol, or maybe setting a cap if you have one for your own protocol. Or it can include slightly different decision, like in the case of exchanges, it can be like, should we add a new asset? Which gets even a little bit more complicated when we are talking about lending protocols. Sometimes it's about complex decisions which regard crypto economics, right? The economic incentives behind that systems. And that can be in the form of inflation rate, like slashing, burning, penalties of any kind. And there are pretty much almost really mandatory decisions that have to be made about the protocol upgrades. Sometimes these are kind of no-brainers because they are security-related issue. Someone spotted a bug within your smart contracts, being that a typo or an actual bug, and then you want to deploy a fix as fast as possible. Sometimes it's the community which is taking its own shape, and eventually requesting very specific features for you to implement. And sometimes it's also optimization. I think that's a relevant thing to mention because Solidity is very much at this infancy as a programming language, and we are still not there at the stable version. So we might end up having tons of different solutions to optimize our code and therefore save more gas in the future. But some other times, it's really about more complex decision about risk, and we have been seeing a variety of different protocols playing with different kind of governance. Like you might think of all the stuff that happened within MakerDAO, but also most recently to the new governance model that Compound has been rolling out. And they have to take different difficult decisions, like what is the collateralization factor of a specific asset, how the interest rate model should look like, and so on and so forth. Now, the last kind of governance action that I like to speak about are circuit breakers. Personally, I think circuit breakers are very much undervalued by the DeFi community. If we learned something in 2020, is that this industry is extremely new, and things can go bad pretty quick, as we have been seeing in these few months of 2020. So one of the kind of mandatory governance action to consider is how do we pause things if we have to. And this can take many forms, from pausing trading, or like freezing liquidation if you're a lending protocol, or freezing borrowing, or going to a very drastic solution such as an emergency shutdown. Now, the industry of DeFi came out with a few different strategies in order to put in practice these governance actions. And some of these strategies is like having no strategy whatsoever. Right? This is kind of the case of Uniswap, for instance, which really pioneered this idea of going to mainnet with a set of rules that cannot be changed. And I think that was an extremely relatable idea for a lot of us, because it pretty much removes any single point of failure by the system. On the other side, though, it makes some stuff very difficult, right? It's very difficult to do even easy upgrades to the protocol itself. For instance, thinking about the ERC 777 situation, we have been known about that flow since 2019. If there was maybe a way to govern Uniswap, it could have been easy to roll out a fix for that. But that wasn't the case, because eventually they had to bundle this ERC 777 fix with a bunch of other things into a completely version 2 of the protocol. And for the same reason, they cannot have stuff like circuit breaker or emergency shutdown. Now, we've been pretty lucky with Uniswap because everything worked out to be great. But if that wasn't the case, many people could have been at risk. They can have like stuff like new asset listing, right? That's pretty easy for an AMM because you can have completely permissionless listing of new asset. It gets a little bit messy for other stuff, such as lending protocol, though. And then you have other strategies, right? Like admin keys. Now, pretty much everyone hates admin keys, and I think it's we can all relate to why that is the case. People feel like teams, might eventually go through an exit scam or collude between themselves in order to steal the money. So that's not super great. But I would also argue that another reason why we really need to think about removing admin keys and why it's important to remove a single point of failure is that really life is unpredictable. And even if I wish that never to happen, like it's possible that an entire dev team might enter into an airplane and never land, right? So this is kind of the risk that we need to think about users of DeFi protocols. And then there are DAOs. Now, DAOs, I think, are a very interesting model because they kind of bundle together all the benefits of admin keys by still removing the single point of failure. So you can really have, you can end up in a situation when you can have managed smart contract. That means that they can implement, for instance, circuit breaker to pause things if they are not going to the right direction. You can very well take decision about listing of new asset. You can change parameters, pull a lever, but you can also have safe upgradability for legacy or for security reasons. And you remove the single point of failure, which is great. I don't quite like the umbrella definition of decentralized by itself, but I think we can all agree that it's gonna be a better degree of decentralization compared to admin keys or even multisig. Now, I'd like to speak a little bit more about how are we implementing DAO governance within PieDao. But before I do that, I need to explain very briefly what pies are. Now, pies, if you never heard about it, are kind of a special mix between a liquidity pool and an index fund. Taking as an example BTC++, which has been the first product coming out of PieDao at some point in March, which is pretty much an equal weight allocation between all the different representation of Bitcoin in the Ethereum network, which can be used, as I was saying, as a liquidity pool or as an index fund. You can use it as an index fund as easy as buying and holding the token, which means you can transfer it and then you get an equal representation and exposure of all these different Bitcoin representation. But since BTC++ is implemented as a smart pool into the balancer ecosystem with custom functionality, then you can also trade assets within the pool as it functions as a multidimensional AMM. And obviously, as a liquidity provider, you get to accrue some fees. Now you can see while in this kind of product like BTC++ or USD++, a lot of this governance decision go into play. We have like the new listing of assets, obviously new representation of BTC are coming into mainnet fairly soon. We have a number of safeguards mechanism in place, because since you are putting together different assets, you might also want to act if something weird is happening. And that's really like what PieDao does and when it comes to play. So they govern pies, and they are pretty much the representation of the social layer and monitor tools that are required to make this product function. Now, from one side, you see like this administrative function, adding or removing asset, changing the weights, or changing the swap fees. But I want to focus on really the circuit breaker functionality. Now, since PieDao managed these pools, it can also see if potentially something weird is going on, which also means they can stop trading as soon as they understand one asset is at risk of failing. Also, the DAO has been putting in place a cap system to make sure that anytime they don't feel super comfortable with the cap, they can reduce that, or they can even put it to 0, and we're going to see how that is useful in a moment. Now, looking at this safeguards mechanism, they've been pretty much helpful in recent events. Like you might have heard of what happened with the AMBTC Uniswap pool and lend.fme exploit of April 18th. Now, in that moment, there was a lot of confusion, especially in the very first hour, and PieDao decided to really trigger all the security circuit breaker mechanism that he had in place. So even if no IMBTC per se was stolen, eventually the DAO decided to pause trading as he wanted to make sure that no stolen fund could be swapped into the BTC++ pool. Since there is a system of cap that has been set so that BTC++ holder can rest assured that no stolen fund, if there were any, which was not the case, could be added to the pool. Another interesting way of looking at it is IM with their own private governance to some degree. At some point, they decided to understand what's going on. And in order to do that, they decided to freeze transfer of IMBTC. Now, I find relevant to mention that BTC++ transfers were not frozen, which means even if the trade closed and the cap was 0, like BTC++ was still liquid within that process, to somewhat giving a more liquid solution instead of holding BTC in isolation. Now, after that happened, the DAO had to reach consensus if was it the right moment to actually restore things. And that happened through a security assessment with a different stakeholder, and eventually formalized and notarized through an on-chain vote. Now, in that regard, I think I want to summarize the policy of circuit breaking in PieDao as, when do we do it? Often. It's really part of the idea that it doesn't really matter to lose like a few hours of trading. It doesn't really matter to lose a few hours of service in that regard within the trading part. It's better to pause things as far as there is any kind of risk that any of the assets might be a risk. Now, the way pausing works, it's actually pretty simple. So DAO can be slow to some degree in performing specific actions, but this is not necessarily the case for pausing, as using pre-signed transaction, which can be broadcasted with huge gas cost, can actually enable teams to act very quickly on functions like voting. Restoring, though, is a different, right? More time, that requires an off-chain assessment, but also a non-chain notarizing event, which takes normally 3 days. Now, I don't want to by any means kind of come here and declare that DAOs are really the solution for governance of DeFi protocol, as they have their own challenges, right? And one of these challenges is really signaling of the votes, like votes have to be widely communicated. so that even casual observer are kept informed at any time. And in that regard, I think off-chain governance, or what you might define as rough consensus, plays a big role. We really at PieDao think about consensus as a two-stage mechanism, where rough consensus mostly happens on chain, off-chain, excuse me, and then you have a notarizing effect, which happens on chain. Why is that important? Well, it's important because off-chain venues create, a very interesting open forum for discussion. In places like Discord, in places like the forum or GitHub issue, all this kind of stuff, nobody knows. Like, you don't even have to necessarily being a token holder, for instance, but you can still vocalize your own opinions about what is supposed to be done, which is incredibly helpful. And then you can try to influence the community in any way you want, and then eventually that will be reflected through an on-chain box. There are still many different ways. I think we will see evolutions, and we are experimenting with new ways. Like, one of the initiative, it's right now using like the POAP tokens to make sure we can keep track of the attendance of community calls. That's might end up having something to do with governance in the future or not, but it's an interesting experiment to do to kind of further the development of rough consensus. Now, the last thing I want to mention, you might think, do we really need this circuit breaker even if we have audited code? Now, if you're asking yourself that, I will say yes, we do. Like, all code has bugs, and it's supposed to have bugs. Like, even major protocols which have been audited by best firms, which spend all did all that was in their ability to protect their users, might eventually have found bugs in their code. So demand more circuit breaker mechanism in your DeFi products than the products that you use. So in conclusion, I want to end up by saying that I think that yes, some control over DeFi protocols is mostly beneficial. DAOs are generally a way to control protocols without the risk of an admin keys. They are not perfect, great. DAOs can still act quickly using pre-signed transactions. And I would generally invite every DeFi developer to think about a policy which includes fast or slow rule. And then, as a final thing, yes, code slow, but it's definitely not the only one. And as a liberal conscious, please try to understand all the risk before using DeFi protocols. I know many other speakers have been doing very specific talks about that. So this is the conclusion of my talk, and then you can ping me on Twitter, or you can ping PieDao specifically if you want to kind of debate this argument. Now I will see if there is any question about it. I actually think we have, I don't see any question at least, but if you do, please feel free to reach out on Twitter to talk about governance, to talk about the challenges of governance and what we can do to govern DeFi protocols at the best we can. Therefore, I don't see any. And I see one, which is Alpha Block. How difficult was it to kickstart community? Well, I think PieDao kind of comes from a few different communities being joined together, as a few of the people involved has been really coming from a few different communities, from a few different projects coming together, and that was extremely beneficial. The community has been really emerging on its own, which I think was quite surprising to see, and being able to self-organize. That being said, it did require some time. in order to do that. But I think if coordination, like if you leave the community coordinate itself, but you kind of try to at least inspire best practice, that works pretty well. Then another question is, how can we trust the community to be right about governance? Do we have any data that community-led governance is better than foundation-led or developer dictatorship? After all, communities, especially nowadays, can be easily manipulated. Echo chambers on social media, fake news. Yeah, that's a great question. Yeah, that's why I said to some degree, I think we need to think about DAOs as removing the single point of failure. Now, I'm not saying by any means that this is like the final solution. That being said, I'm very bullish on the experimentation of some governance mechanism, and I will actually write about that fairly soon, about pretty much the idea of having two different governance layers, one which is more generic, which definitely might not be like eventually like the people making the best decisions, but it can eventually work as a final layer of control over special commissions of people, which instead have the best skills to make very specific vertical decision about technical developments, for instance, or other kind of stuff. Are pies redeemable for underlying tokens? Yes, they are. BTC++, for instance, is always redeemable for all the underlying tokens, which are currently for PBTC, WBTC, SBTC, and IMBTC. What DAO structure do you use? Currently, we are proudly built on top of Aragon from the Dandelion template, and some of these governance mechanism I was mentioning before will eventually, hopefully, be deployed as Aragon apps pretty soon. By the way, thank you, Mick, for relaying the questions. As I don't really see the question tab over here. But if there are any more, please, feel free to make it now. I can see the message popping out quickly, so that should be it. Oh. I think that's it.
All right, cool. Thank you guys so much for this really great talk. We're going to transition to the next session then.
Thank you very much. Ciao.
Thanks.